Thank the member and call the member for Holt.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise tonight, obviously, to speak in the address and reply, particularly responding to the Turnbull government's recent budget, but also obviously the Governor-General's speech. And I guess one of the key themes of my speech, particularly in rapidly growing outer suburban Melbourne, are issues like infrastructure, population growth, social services being provided to them. According to the National Growth Areas Alliance, Australia's fast-growing outer suburbs are home to 5 million people. In the Casey region of my electorate of Holt, we are home to the fastest-growing suburb in Australia, which is Cranbourne East. There's rapid population growth occurring in the outer suburbs, but the key problem, as I've said, is social infrastructure, roads, schools, jobs and services, which aren't keeping up with this population growth. Now, research commissioned by the NGAA shows that there is a $50 billion backlog in infrastructure for fast-growing outer suburbs like mine, and unless it's seriously addressed, that figure will grow to $73 billion in the next 15 years. But then the population in these areas is expected to reach 7.5 million people. So I'd encourage the Turnbull government, in light of that, notwithstanding the budget that they've just brought down, there needs to be special consideration given to setting up a specialised fund for the outer suburbs in the same way that the rural and regional areas have a dedicated fund. I believe it's only fair that growing outer suburbs are treated equally to get their fair share of infrastructure funding. As an example of that, in 2015 I supported the investment of $10 million under the National Stronger Regions Fund to build a new arts precinct at Bunjil Place at Westfield Fountain Gate. That'll be finished later on this year. However, subsequent to that, the Turnbull government cut the National Stronger Regions Fund, replacing it with a Building Better Regions Fund that now excludes outer suburban electorates like Holt. Now, given the amount of population growth that's occurring in areas like Holt and outer suburbs dotted all around the country, it's absolutely ludicrous that you couldn't actually reuse that fund or funding that's in that fund for projects like Bunjil Place. There are tens and tens of Bunjil Place type projects that can't be funded, but it was seen to be good enough. Perhaps it was the change in Prime Minister. It was good enough when Tony Abbott was Prime Minister that we could actually access this fund. It's now not good enough since Malcolm Turnbull became Prime Minister. We can't access that. And it particularly strikes me when we have a local bowls club, for example, the Narre Warren Bowls Club, which is looking for about $1 million to fund a new shade structure. Now, that sounds like a lot of money for a bowls club, but the innovation in this design, and particularly given the work that's happening in the private sector around Bunjil Place, around Westfield Fountain Gate, it's becoming a regional hub. And the concept behind this is to have a shaded area where people from everywhere can use it as an entertainment area, and it just fits in perfectly. But we recently wrote to the responsible minister for the Stronger Regions Fund and were told, well, they didn't have funding for that anymore. It's just absolutely ridiculous that as I said, yet 12 months before you could actually access this fund, now you can't. So how many other projects like the one I mentioned? There's also a Sikh temple. The previous member was talking about the contribution that the Sikh community make in our area, and they have a substantial presence in my area. They are a great boon to our community. They work very closely with me in areas like taxi driving and the compensation the Victorian State Government are paying to taxi drivers, and also issues like community safety. They've just been at the forefront of representing the general community about these issues. They have a wonderful temple that they want to expand so they can offer services like feeding people, homeless people, at night. That would be another project that would, under normal circumstances in the previous fund, have qualified for funding like that, but now it doesn't. And it sends a message, I think, to the outer suburban community. They can see the great growth that's occurring, the population growth. If you drive down Clyde Road in Narre Warren going to Cranbourne, you can see the phenomenal growth that's occurring. And you really do know that it's the fastest growing area in Australia when you drive down there because of the number of houses that are being built. So you would think that, given the taxes that all of those people pay and the lives that they're establishing there, that there'd be a very well-developed area. There'd be the sort of the social infrastructure. There would be funding capabilities, capacities to build soccer stadiums, to build football stadiums, to build all the infrastructure that a growing outer suburban area would need. But there's not. And I think that's absolutely ridiculous. So my request as part of the address and reply is for the Turnbull government to look at what his predecessor did do and then see whether or not we can do something like that, a readjustment or a separate fund that is created so that the other suburbs, like mine, can actually access the regional funds that I believe that they're entitled to. Obviously, there's an issue particularly about community safety. One of the great things about my constituency, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that we have been touched and struck quite hard by terrorism and extremism in our region, in our area, in our very suburbs. And particularly when we had the shooting at the Endeavour Hills Police Station in 2014, the foiled Anzac Day plot in April 2015, the way in which the community has come together cohesively, collectively, in an inclusive way, in a measured way, it would do great credit for some of the shock jocks and the people that mouth off about terrorism, and others, even in this place, that mouth off about various communities. If they actually came down to my community and saw the cohesiveness that the community has, notwithstanding the challenges that they have experienced. And I'd certainly like to thank the agencies for the work that they do, our intelligence agencies, the federal police for the work that they do, and also, in particular, our local police, who are right at the front line of that challenge and that threat has not abated. It is still there. But one thing we won't do, Madam Deputy Speaker, is allow to that threat, however it manifests itself, to shape how we live our lives. And that's what I said is the great credit of our community, to our community. You walk into the Westfield Shopping Centre, you walk into Endeavour Hills Shopping Centre, Cranbourne Shopping Centre, we have a very strong, resilient, capable group of people there. And they don't, as I said, they do great credit to the community, and particularly those that are trying to foment hate in various sections of the community. I remember when I first came in here in 1999, I said one of the worst forms of politics that you could try was wedge politics, dividing one element of the community up against another element. And we saw elements of that in 1996, when we had a particular person that established a party. And I can recall that that party was going to be established in Dandenong around the late 90s, it was 96, 97. And for the first time, I saw almost riots in the streets around the Dandenong Town Hall when that party tried to establish itself right in the heart of multicultural Melbourne. And tragically for me, from what I can see, there was such a strong feeling of, well, this is not Australia. It's not about wedging groupings against each other. It doesn't matter what race, colour, creed you were or are, that we're all Australians. We're all together in this journey through being part of the Australian story. But what disturbs me looking down the track, and that meeting was not successful. They didn't establish a branch of One Nation. Let's call the party the party. But when others then use the difficulties that we experience in a local area, with be it terrorism or community safety, to again start looking at a community and attacking that community, that doesn't help us at all. It doesn't help us when we deal with it. As you know, I'm Deputy Chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee. It doesn't help us in trying to deal with the problem. It doesn't help us in trying to solve the problem. It just causes that tension in between communities that doesn't actually solve the problem. It's not going to reverse the problem. It actually exacerbates the problem. And the great thing, as I said, is I'd like to say, when you've got strong communities like our Sikh community, we have a very large Indian community, Sri Lankan community, you could go on a Chinese community. It's a very multicultural area now, is that they're not succumbing to that fear. Although I would touch on one issue that I did campaign on during the federal election, which might sound a bit strange, which was community safety. Not community safety in the sense of national security, but community safety in the sense of people not feeling safe in their homes. And that was an issue that has emerged, and I think a number of people on the other side of the fence were quite confused as to why I was campaigning on that. But my attention was drawn to the concern about community safety when I was door-knocking the area around Cranbourne East during the election or prior to the election campaign, and someone was too afraid to open her door. And originally I thought, well, of course that would happen because it's a politician door-knocking, it's around election time. But disturbingly, when the person actually did come out and identified who I was, the reason why she wouldn't open the door was she was afraid of local crime and local gangs that were around the area. And this has been, we conducted a forum during the federal election campaign, and we've been campaigning on this issue ever since. When you move out to the outer suburbs, and I've talked about the explosive growth that we have in, say, from my electorate, I have 120,000 electors, but I have 196,000 people living in my electorate. So it's a very large number of people. Those people do deserve, and they shift out there to be kept safe. That's our job. That's a government's job. That's what we have to do, be it state or federal or local, but predominantly in the national sphere and the macro sphere, it's federal. In the state sphere, obviously it's the state government. And so we've seen, through the investment of the Andrews government, more police coming online. I think there's funding for nearly 3,000 extra police. But in the meantime, there's still much to be done. That's a welcome development, but we really do need to ensure that to get those resources out there as fast as possible, but it takes time to train police officers. It takes the resources to train them, and then they need to get the experience before they can become fully operational. And so we certainly welcome that investment, but I just draw the attention of my state colleagues that those concerns still remain. There is still an issue. There are still ways in which this difficulty can be challenged, and I think it's something that we should talk about more, and I'll be talking about more on behalf of my constituency because that's raised as an issue. The other issue I just wanted to touch on, and particularly given the national security issue that I just talked about, was the power of, if we want to talk about, we've had the federal government has delivered a budget, and some even within the honourable members on the other side's own ranks are talking about it being socialist, which is a very scary concept when you've been throwing it at the Turnbull government. Perhaps Malcolm in 1994 to 96 might have been close to the mark, but I don't regard him as being a socialist at this point in time, and we could talk about that in much greater detail. But I think in touching, one of the key concerns that I have, and it touches on national security, but it touches on other areas as well, is the issue of how people perceive the role of government these days. In national security, a classic case in point. I was in the United States after the San Bernardino massacre. I was there in my capacity as Deputy Chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee, and I was there meeting intelligence agencies, the CIA, the FBI, and also Department of State and other people as well. And the great issue of concern that was being raised by those agencies was the fact that the Apple iPhone that was used by the perpetrators of that terrorist act, two individuals, that Apple would not unlock the phone for the FBI. And so the FBI then had to resort to other means to actually ensure that that phone could be unlocked. And it struck me as someone that was in government, and we had cross-jurisdictional conversations about this, and it is something that I would put on the record. The question is, when do private companies dictate how we run national security in this country and in the United States of America and the United Kingdom, because they're similar-minded jurisdictions? And this is not an argument to say that we should have further sweeping national security reforms that compel companies to be doing things that they might not want to do, that would inhibit the way in which they make money. That's not what I want. But I would say that what has occurred to me in my entire time in the national security space, and that's about 12 years, is the increasing challenge that companies, major companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and other such companies make when, for example, Apple, for example, the manufacturer of the phones, when there is a need from a national security perspective to access their telecommunications devices or communication streams. And I think this is one of the issues that, come what may, and in some way, shape or form, that governments, this government, whether or not we're successful at the next election, the Shorten Labor government, governments across the world, in particular the Western world, not so much Russia and others, but our Western democracies are going to have to confront. And that is, where do we draw a limit on the role of the state? See, my belief, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that our primary role as a government is to provide security for our citizens. We do that. We've sent people overseas on conflicts to defend our way of life, and they've served our country incredibly faithfully and well, and continue to do so in conflicts that we are dealing with at the present period of time, in the eradication of ISIS, in particular in Iraq. So that's our primary responsibility. Then the question occurs, in a functioning Western democracy, where does the state intersect with the role of imposing perhaps legislation on a corporation that compels it to provide information that might be essential for the safeguarding of national security? And an example, as I said, was San Bernardino. And there are other examples that I've been provided with in classified briefings that I can't go into. But this is going to be a major problem. And so I'm certainly hoping to travel to the United States in the next couple of months. And why does it then, am I talking about this as an address and reply? Because national security affects everyone. We don't have functioning economies. We don't have a functioning way of life unless our security is protected. If it's at a macro level, national security; at a micro level, with our state police, with local law and order. So my question, and I guess there's an area that I intend to flesh out, and as I said, I've had conversations with counterparts in the United States and in the United Kingdom on an issue that's been going now for some period of time, is that I do believe that government is going to have to play a greater role in terms of the information that it might need to obtain by from companies like Apple, Google, not in an authoritarian way, but in a way that we don't have to go to third parties, which I think is a very unhelpful way of doing that. In particular, citing the San Bernardino case, it's just not going to work. We really do need those companies to come to the party. That doesn't mean necessarily building back doors in, as some have suggested in some of the Apple products or other products on the market. But it does mean that when we really do need to access the technologies, the data streams, the devices, that we can do that in order to keep our community safe. And I do promise you that this is going to be an evolving conversation. We talk about encryption, and the companies have become remarkably successful providing encryption services that basically protect organisations commercially and protect individuals, and that's to be welcome. But the question in the overall balance is, where do you get that balance right, from them trying to protect their customer base to the issue of national security? And this, I think, is going to be one of the great arguments that we will have as governments of any persuasion over the next 2 to 3 years, particularly as I think we should anticipate that there will be more leaks in terms of what agencies do. One thing I do disagree with in terms of in my discussions with the Americans is that they were quite confident about the fact that there would not be further leaks, and this was last year, and we've seen further leaks. When you have aggregated data in any way, shape or form, it can be hacked, regardless of what the security levels will be. So I think we should assume that that's going to happen. We should assume at some stage in the national security environment in the next 5 years, 10 years, that we'll have ongoing leaks about the way our agencies do their business. And that is going to provide a challenge for legislators and for governments and security agencies. But we're operating in that environment. I don't think there's any need to pretend that we're not. I think what we do need to do as a safeguard, though, and I'll finish off here, is that we do need to ensure that we have appropriate oversight of these agencies by not so much the executive of the parliament, but by duly elected committees that constitute parliamentary members. I'm fortunate to be part of a committee, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, which I think does perform an important oversight role. I understand there's an independent review that's being conducted into the intelligence agencies by some nominated individuals, and also the oversight arrangements, which include the oversight arrangements by our committees. But I would say to those independent reviewers and to this government and to any government that as we may need to increase our powers, if we do not increase the oversight, we will not have the support of the public. As I said, you can be rest assured we'll have more leaks. And when we have more leaks, they need to be investigated and there needs to be more oversight. that should come by elected officials. It should not come just from people that are commissioned for the purpose of the inquiry. And that, again, I think you will see in the next 2 to 5 years will be another of the great arguments of our age. And I will leave it there, Madam Deputy Speaker. Thank you.